Right. Good morning once again, everyone. It is 10:05, so I'm going to start the class. I will be making a recording. So if there are students who cannot attend, they can listen to the recording afterwards. I hope I'll be able to share it because that's the reason why we're using the big blue button. There are issues with sharing the Teams recordings. Welcome you. So today, as I've indicated to you last week, from Learning Unit 9, 10, 11, it is going downhill. The work is much easier, and to a large extent, much of what you will learn here is repeats of something that you've done previously, just applied to a different sector. So today we are going to look at wages and productivity. As previously, I'm going to do the class and then I'm going to give opportunity for questions afterwards. So please ask if you have any questions once the class ends or this section of the class, Learning Unit 9, and then I'll give time for questions, and then we are going to go to Learning Unit 10. But if there is a burning issue, you can just, I've not muted you automatically. You can unmute at the moment. So then just unmute and speak up. I'm not going to be able to see your hands all of the time because I am looking at the slides for the class. Right. Okay, so as I've indicated, today we are going to look at wages and productivity. So the first thing we know for many variables, we have to distinguish between the nominal and the real variables. So we look at nominal wage, which is the wage expressed in monetary form and does not take into account changes in prices, whereas the real wage is the nominal wage adjusted for the effects of inflation. So it takes into account the fact that prices have changed. So purchasing power will be based on the real wage because it is the amount of goods and services that can be purchased with a unit of currency. So the purchasing power of your wage will be affected by the price level, and therefore it is affected by the real wage. So make sure you are able to distinguish between those different concepts. So if we want to derive real wages from nominal wages, we take the nominal wage and we use the CPI index or any other index of inflation. In this case, we chose to use CPI because CPI is the inflation indicator that has to do with consumers. So therefore, of course, it's going to affect the real wage. The CPI indicates changes in prices of a consumer basket of goods. Right, so to calculate the real wage, we take the nominal wage divided by the CPI times 100. So that is the calculation that was done here. Take note that 2021 is the base year, and therefore the CPI for 2021 is 100. So to calculate the real wage for 2019, what did we do? We calculated, we took the nominal wage divided by the CPI for 2019 times 100 over 1, and that gives us the real wage of 22,222. Now, if you look at these wages, I'm not going to discuss the calculation of the rest of them. They're done in exactly the same way using the nominal wages and the CPI for each of the years. If you look at these real wages, it's quite difficult to interpret them to see when they go up and when they go down because it's quite large amounts, and therefore it's also sometimes useful to change these to a real wage index. Now, to change a series to an index, we take the real wage for that year, we divide it by the real wage for the base year, which in this case is 2021, times 100 over 1. So for 2019, it will then be the 222, that should be a 2, divided by the nominal, the wage for the nominal or the real wage, which is the same for the 2021 base year, 23,200 times 100 over 1, and that gives us 95.8. Right, so that is how you calculate the real wage index. And now we can easily see that the real wage increased from 2019 to 2020 quite substantially. It increased a little bit in 2021, and then it decreased again in 2022. So if we have an index, it's relatively easy to see how the variable changed. So wage differentials refers to the structure of wages and how it differs across categories. For example, it can be for different industries, it can be for different education levels. So wage differentials indicate to us how wages are different across different sectors in the economy, depending on what variable you are considering at that moment. So if we look at this table, it shows us for different sectors the average monthly earnings. And here you can see it's for March 2023. And we can see that if we look at these different wages in the different sectors, that in the wholesale and retail trade, the average monthly earnings is much lower than in the electricity, gas, and water supply sector. In the mining and quarrying, it's the second highest, and then community, social, and personal services, the third highest, etc. So this gives you an indication of the sectors and how the different monthly earnings is different across those sections. So if you are looking at where you are probably going to enter, you can see because you are studying towards a BCom degree, you will highly likely be in the financial and business services sector. So you can see that is more or less there in the middle where the average, as far as the average monthly earnings are concerned. So if you are thinking that you are not interested in earning that kind of salary, maybe you must try to change your qualification so that you'll be able to move into one of these other two sectors. But of course, this also varies over time, and definitely this is to a large extent determined by the level of education that is expected in the different sectors. We know that in the wholesale and retail trade, people can enter relatively easy with a matric or even a below matric qualification, and the same applies to construction, but there they definitely need a little bit more skill to be able to find a job, and the same applies to manufacturing. And then when we move to the financial and business services sector, we know that for many of the jobs, the post-school qualification is required. So definitely these average monthly earnings are also affected by the qualification level. When we consider wages, we have to look at the minimum living levels, because that will determine what is an acceptable wage level. So the minimum living levels is compiled annually, and it provides information on the minimum living wage of an unskilled worker with an average size family to satisfy reasonable needs. So it indicates how much you need. And it is this information is published by Stats SA in the National Poverty Lines publication, PO 310.1. So you will also have to do some questions for assignment 5 on these. So the food poverty line refers to the amount of money that an individual will need to afford the minimum required daily energy intake. This is also commonly referred to as the extreme poverty line. Then there is the lower bound poverty line, which includes the food poverty line, but it also includes the average amount spent on essential non-food items of households whose total expenditure is equal to the food poverty line. So it is just the essential non-food items that's included there. And then there's the upper bound poverty line, which refers to the food poverty line, plus the average amount spent on all non-food items of households whose food expenditure is equal to the food poverty line. So not just the essential non-food items, but all non-food items spent by those households. So for 2024, in this statistical release by Stats SA, it was indicated that the food poverty line, the amount that you need to be able to afford the minimum required daily energy intake, was 796 Rand. The lower bound poverty line was 1,109 Rand, and the upper bound poverty line was 1,634 Rand. So what you can do is you can go and look at these different publications for the different years and see how this has changed over the years. So productivity is an important concept, especially when we look at our trade with foreign countries. If we want to be competitive and we want our goods to be exported to other countries, then productivity is a very important concept that will affect that. And we know that there is a relationship between remuneration and productivity. So it should be that when productivity increases, remuneration should also increase. Usually it doesn't work the other way around. It doesn't work that when you increase people's remuneration, their productivity also increases. I think it is true, and we all know that we can say that overall people are inherently lazy. So if you're going to reward them without performance, they are not going to perform, most likely. It does not apply to everyone, but it is it's highly likely. If you it's just human nature. But if you do it the other way around, that when productivity increases, you increase remuneration, then there's an incentive to increase productivity. So definition and measurement of productivity. It is the ratio which measures the amount of output that is produced with given amounts of factor inputs. So I've now spoken about productivity of labor, but also we have to consider productivity of capital. We can also consider productivity of land. So you can look at all the different factor inputs and look at what is the amount of output produced by those factor inputs. So there are different measures of productivity. As we've indicated, labor productivity is the one that we're interested in this section because we are especially looking at wages. So labor productivity is output divided by the labor input, and that gives us the output per unit of labor input, right? So that can be, for example, the total production of a company divided by the total number of workers, and that is going to give you then the output per unit of labor input for that company. If we're looking at the country as a whole, then it can be real GDP here divided by the number of laborers or the number of persons working in the country, the number of persons employed, and that is going to give you then the output per unit of labor for the economy as a whole. So here is just an example of labor productivity in a steel plant for different years. So it provides the output per year in tons of steel. It provides an indication of the number of workers that was employed. So we can see then that the output per worker would then be the output per year divided by the number of workers. And then you can also, of course, change this to an index, as we've previously discussed. In this case, 2020 is regarded as a base year because we can see the index there is 100. Right, now to consider how this will impact competitiveness, it is of course necessary that we also take the wages that are paid to these workers into account. So we can see that if we look at the output per worker, that it seems that the productivity increased in 2021, it decreased a little bit in 2022, started to increase again in 2023, and increased quite significantly in 2024. But if we want to know whether this steel plant is going to be competitive internationally, we also have to take the wages into account. So as now we've indicated, productivity is not only based on one production factor. Therefore, partial productivity measures, although we use it and we look at it when decisions are taken, these have limitations because it is possible maybe the labor productivity increased, but it is actually capital that was increased. And the capital productivity has decreased. So that will mean then that the overall productivity may also have decreased. So it's also necessary to discuss to consider multi-factor productivity. So multi-factor productivity consider labor and capital intensity of reduction, as well as other factors that may affect productivity, such as skill levels of labor and management. So it's a much wider concept that looks at all the factors that can affect productivity as a whole, not just labor productivity, not just capital productivity, but also how skillful the management is, how effective decisions that are taken by management is, because we also know that management can have a large effect on how production is taking place within a company or within the country. And then also skill levels of labor is also an important factor because low-skilled workers may most likely be less productive than higher skilled workers. But then we also have to consider that lower skilled workers will earn lower wages than higher skilled workers. So it is not a simple concept to determine. Okay, so when we consider labor, the wages of labor, so together with the competitiveness, we are looking at the unit labor cost. So unit labor cost is used in international comparisons of productivity. So to calculate, we're going to look at how we calculate unit labor cost. And you have to understand and go and have a look in your textbook, why is unit labor cost such an important concept in any economy? So make sure you understand the significance of unit labor cost. So how do we calculate unit labor cost? Labor productivity is equal to output of workers divided by the number of workers, as we've indicated previously. Now, unit labor cost will then be the number of workers multiplied by the wage rate or earnings per worker divided by the total output. So unit labor cost is the total wages that are earned by all the workers together divided by the total output by all the workers together. That will give you unit labor costs. So we can also rewrite unit labor cost in this way. It's total wages times the number of laborers divided by the total output. And then to take into account productivity, we can then say that it is wages divided by total output divided by the number of laborers. So it is the earnings per worker divided by the labor productivity. Remember, we said if we divide output by the number of workers, that gives us labor productivity. So now labor unit cost is then earnings per worker divided by labor productivity. Now, in a dynamic context, so in what that means when there's growth in the economy, the growth rate in unit labor cost is approximately equal to the growth rate of earnings per worker minus the growth rate of output per worker. So the change in the wages, the growth in the wages, minus the growth in labor productivity gives us an indication of the growth in unit labor costs. So let's say that wages increased by 10% and productivity increased by 7%. That means that the growth in unit labor costs was then 3%, which gives us an indication that unit labor cost has increased. Although productivity has increased by 7%, it did not increase as much as wages, which increased by 10%. So both increase in wages as well as increases in labor productivity has to be taken into account when we consider growth in unit labor cost. Let's look at a few examples. So if wages increase and productivity does not change, unit labor cost will of course increase. On the other hand, if productivity increases and wages do not increase, then unit labor costs will decrease. If wages increases a faster rate than productivity, it means unit labor cost will increase. And if wages increase at a slower rate than productivity, unit labor costs will decrease. Right, so those are the different options, the different things that can take place and how unit labor cost will be affected by it. Of course, when unit labor cost increases, the country becomes less competitive, and when unit labor cost decreases, the company as well as the country becomes more competitive. So if you want a company or a country to be more competitive, it is important that productivity should increase faster than wages. Here is just an example of what happened if we compare Taiwan and South Africa to each other, looking at the period from 1975 to 1994. So in Taiwan, the average increase in labor productivity in manufacturing over that period was 5.9%. In South Africa, the increase in labor productivity in manufacturing was 0.6%. If we look at the increase in nominal earnings per employee in Taiwan, the average increase in nominal earnings was 13.9% over the same period, whereas in South Africa, it was a little bit higher at 14.1%. However, because labor productivity in South Africa did not increase by a lot, it means that the average increase in unit labor cost in South Africa was much higher than for Taiwan. And this then implies that Taiwan, as far as manufacturing is concerned, is much more competitive than South Africa. And if we want to increase the competitiveness of South Africa, it means that either we are going to have to decrease the nominal earnings, the increase in nominal earnings, that it doesn't grow so fast, or we increase labor productivity. And I think you will all agree that increasing the labor productivity is a much better option than decreasing the nominal earnings per employee. Okay, so we've discussed the implications for international competitiveness. So if we look at this diagram, which is also in your textbook, it explains the relationship between labor productivity, wages, unit labor costs, and employment. And actually, it also explains to us the inflation spiral. Why increases in wages can contribute to inflation spiral. Let's explain this to you. So if there is an increase in wages, for example, due to trade union pressure, and nominal wages then increase, and that increase is greater than the increase in labor productivity, it means that unit labor cost increases. So what is the effect of that? It can increase production costs, or it can also result that capital replaces labor. So that will mean then that unemployment will increase. So if we go this route and the production cost increases, it implies that producers charges higher selling prices for goods and services. In South Africa, because capital has to be imported, it will usually be very expensive to replace labor with capital. So replacing labor with capital will also result in higher selling prices. Okay, if we look at the international viewpoint, it means that South African products become less competitive in the global market, and it may mean that some firms, especially smaller labor-intensive firms, have to close down and retrench workers, which of course increase unemployment. If we look at what happens inside the country when the prices increase due to the increase in wages, it means that price levels increase, the cost of living increase, workers then demand wage increases. So we are back there. And you can see we start the whole cycle again. So this is why I said that this is also an explanation of an inflation spiral, because it shows us how increases in wages that is not accompanied by increases in productivity can result in the first place, unemployment when workers are laid off because the companies cannot continue to produce because they are not competitive due to the increase in unit labor cost that was not accompanied by an increase in productivity. And that results in higher prices and higher unemployment. So it increases both unemployment and inflation. So you can see that increasing productivity is therefore very, very important in any economy that wishes to grow, as South Africa wished to grow. Right, so that is the end of Learning Unit 9, the presentation for Learning Unit 9. So if you have any questions now, you are welcome to put up your hands and ask. No questions today? Right. If there are no questions, then I am Okay, there's a question and another question. F. Madida. Just unmute yourself.
Okay, how are you, ma'am? Hi,
I'm well, thank you. And you?
I'm fine. Looking at what is happening in the markets at this stage internationally between the USA and China, which scenario that will come out now here, especially when it comes to USA, from what you've been explaining? What scenario are we going to see?
So what is currently happening does not have much to do with productivity. So what countries do is to protect the different sectors in the economy. They have these markups in the form of taxes that importers then have to pay or exporters then have to pay. And that does not have to do with productivity, but with protecting certain sectors in your own economy. So if South Africa, for example, want to protect the textile sector in South Africa and help them to be, to first establish, because of course you can imagine that you cannot just start off and be competitive. So sometimes for a country, it is necessary for a while to protect that company. And that can be, for example, in the form of subsidies that's paid to companies in that sector. So that then decreases those prices. And even though they may not be so productive and their wages may not be so competitive, they can then compete internationally. Okay. But now, what the other country do, like America is now doing, is to say, no, but we do not accept that. You are subsidizing that sector of your economy, but that affects us negatively, because now people in America is going to want to import textiles from South Africa, but we also want to protect our textile sector. So they put, as Trump is now doing, they put a tax on if you want to import from South Africa. And according to Trump, that is what he is trying to do. He is trying to protect the American economy. So he's trying to say or to affect the people in America to rather produce everything inside the country and to buy local produce rather than to import from other countries. So that he's trying to make America less dependent on the rest of the world. That is what he is saying. Now, of course, we know that that has huge repercussions, and it has huge repercussions, especially due to the fact that America is so big, and they were importing so much and exporting so much to different countries. So it is affecting so many economies and so many people in the world. But in effect, that is the reason why they are doing that.
But isn't going to but isn't going to be expensive if they locally produce, let's say they produce a Nike brand, or they produce a Versace brand, because some of these brands, they will buy bags in China for less. Yeah. And then when they are exported to America, America has just put the brand on that particular brand. The textile is not actually from America. So if they have to produce their own, it's going to be expensive for the consumers.
It is. So do you remember the concept opportunity cost that you learned?
Yes.
In your first year. So that is what is, I would say, if I have to look at it from a purely theoretical point of view, they are considering the opportunity cost. Is it better for people to be able to buy Nike Takis at a cheaper price, or is it better for more people to be employed in the American economy? Is it better to try to make the local economy more competitive so that you can, in the end, maybe also export your goods to other countries? Or is it better to provide opportunity to buy brands at cheaper prices? That is now the choice that has to be made. And it seems to me currently they're making that choice to say, we're not so much interested in buying these cheap goods within America. We are more interested in ensuring that America is less dependent on the rest of the world and that more employment is created within the country, and that the different sectors of the economy inside America becomes more competitive so that in the end they will also be able to export more. So definitely you are right to say that it's going to make, for example, Nike Takis and what was produced in China more expensive. But what is the long run effect of that? That also has to be considered. And I think sometimes when we look at our own economy, we also have to think of that and make the more difficult choices. For example, it's very easy to order clothes from Shein. It's also very cheap. But is it good for our economy if we do that? Because it means that people in South Africa that are producing clothes find it difficult to be competitive. They can't compete with Shein prices. In South Africa, you cannot produce a jersey for 250 Rand. It's going to cost more to produce it. So it is difficult choices to make.
I get it.
If economic decisions were easy choices to make, there would not be unemployment and there would not be inflation. But all of those decisions are difficult choices to make. And sometimes, like a baby that is sick, you have to give them medicine. They do not like it. But in the end, it will be good for them. Any more questions?
I was going to make another example with the Nigerian billionaire. I think it's Dawonga or something like that, the name of the guy. He benefited from selling when the president at the time said they will buy oil from Nigeria, not from outside. And then that's how he got to be a billionaire, because he was the main supplier of oil. So I understand when you talk about the opportunity cost, because when we learn, we forget about what we've learned in the past.
Yeah. But now also
that come in the future.
Now I also think that's important. Now, if you take that example, there's now 1 billionaire. Wouldn't it have been better if there were 100 millionaires due to that? So if the opportunities was created in such a way that the income was divided among more people. So, in my mind, that is also an important consideration. When opportunities are created, ensure that the opportunities that are created are not just created for certain people or limited number of people. Ensure that there's a wider base, that more people can share in the extra income that is created, because that is how an economy grows. Not by creating a lot of very wealthy people, a few very wealthy people. It is better to create a lot of mediumly wealthy people, a lot of middle-class people, than to create a few very wealthy people. But of course, if those very wealthy people use their wealth also to the benefit of the country, as some wealthy people do, and they also create employment opportunities, then that is also good for the economy. So once again, I'm saying very difficult choices to make. Any more questions? Mr. Madido, are you happy?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Okay, I'm just going to stop sharing for a minute and change my slides. I'm going. You have Dr. Litter has a question or a remark. Renette?
Yes, thank you, Celia. Morning all. What I will do to assist you and the student with this argument, sorry, I came in late, I had another meeting, on the opportunity cost and incentives and so forth. I came across a very nice book, like the book's title is Think Like an Economist. And in one of the PowerPoint presentations, I've created a slide. So while you're busy, I'll quickly go to my slide and just take a snapshot of it and put it in the screen. That will just assist with the reasoning because all arguments are valid. Thank you.
Are you going to share it now, Renette?
Yeah, just give me a couple of minutes, but you're welcome to continue. It's just to assist the students.
Okay, well, I'm getting
question.
it ready. Yeah. I just have to give you sharing rights, or do you have sharing rights?
I'll take a screenshot of it and post it in the chat, if that's fine with you.
Okay, that would be fine. Thank you.
Okay, then there's no obstacle. Thank you.
Okay, but I've given you sharing rights as well. Right, can everyone see the slides for Learning Unit 10? Financial indicators? Just give me a thumbs up. Yes, okay. Right. So, once again, with regard to Learning Unit 10, it is also work that you've done previously, but it is also work that is covered rather extensively in another module called ECS 2605, the South African Financial System. So this is really just a very brief overview of concepts in the financial sector that we do for this module. So as we know, the most important concept when we're considering the financial sector is money. So money, as you've learned in your first year, is anything that is generally accepted as payment for goods or services in the discharge of debt. Money is therefore a medium of exchange, a store of value, and a unit of account. Income, which people sometimes confuse with money, is the reward earned by the factors of production in the production process. So it can be for the reward for labor, capital, natural resources, and entrepreneurship, and it's received in the form of wages, interest, rent, and profit. All of those form part of income. And therefore, income is not the same as money, but it is usually earned in the form of money. So usually you will receive money as payment or reward for your providing the factor of production, either labor, capital, or natural resources and entrepreneurship, and it is earned in the form of wages, interest, rent, and profit. So make sure you're able to distinguish between money and income. Then the third concept that's important here is wealth. So once again, wealth is not the same as money. It is possible that a person can have no money but has a lot of wealth because they have other types of assets. So the total value of assets that have been accumulated over time minus any possible liabilities, that would be your total wealth. So wealth can be held in many forms, including land, works of art, financial assets such as shares and bonds, and it can also be held in money. But we must remember that usually these other types of assets, we will also tell their value in terms of money. So what they are worth in terms of money. So money is an asset that forms part of wealth because it is a store of value. So make sure you are able to distinguish between these different concepts. Credit is when you need money and you have to borrow it, then you will have to pay, then you acquire credit. So borrowing funds to provide the borrower with the ability to acquire goods or services prior to payment, with the faith that payment will be made in the future. That is what credit is. So you are borrowing now, but you will repay it in the future. And in most cases, there's a charge for borrowing, and that charge is in the form of fees and or interest. So that is credit. So you have to be able to distinguish between the different measures of money that are used in the South African economy. So we use M1A, M1, M2, M3. Those are the different monetary aggregates that we use to measure how much money is circulating in the economy. So when we look at M1A, it only includes banknotes and coins in circulation outside the banking sector, plus current and transmission accounts of the domestic private sector with monetary institutions. So this is wealth that you can use to buy something with immediately. It's available for you either in the form of cash, banknotes and coins, or in the form of an account that you can access immediately. That's M1A. Then M1 includes all M1A plus demand deposits held by the domestic private sector. Then M2 is a little bit wider. It also includes short-term and medium-term deposits held by the domestic private sector. So it includes all of M1A plus demand deposits plus short and medium-term deposits held by the domestic private sector. And then the widest aggregate for money is M3, which also includes long-term deposits. So it includes everything in M2 plus long-term deposits. So long-term deposits would be deposits that will take longer to convert to cash. It takes longer before you can use it to actually buy something with it. to use it as money that you can use to conclude a transaction. Short and medium-term deposits, it will also take time to convert these to cash in order to be able to buy with it, but it will take a little bit shorter time than the long-term deposits. Right, so those are the different definitions of money. You have to understand them and know how each of them are calculated. Information on this is provided in the Reserve Bank Quarterly Bulletin, and you will also see that there are questions on this in Assignment 5, and similar questions can also come up in the exam. Then the next concept that's important in the financial sector is, of course, the interest rate. So you have to be able to define the interest rate. It is the rate of interest is the amount of interest payable over a certain period, expressed as a percentage of the borrowed amount. So that is what an interest rate is. If you borrow a certain amount, and the amount that you have to pay back will usually be higher than the amount that you borrowed, and that difference is called the interest. So interest is the price that a borrower has to pay to enjoy the use of funds he or she does not own, and the return enjoyed by a lender for deferring consumption or parting with liquidity. Because remember now, we are talking about the fact that a borrower has to pay interest, but the person who is lending out the money is going to receive the interest. So that lender is now, for the moment, well, the money that he is lending to the other party, it can't be used by the lender. So he is deferring consumption and or parting with liquidity. So he has to be rewarded for doing that, and that is the interest that he will receive. So we distinguish between simple and compound interest in economics and in the financial market. So simple interest is simply the present value times the interest rate times the period that you are lending it for. Whereas when you look at compound interest, then there's actually two steps that's explained there in your textbook to calculate the compound interest. You then first have to calculate the future value. You use this formula to calculate the future value. And then to calculate the compound interest, it is then the difference between the future value and the present value. So I think it's going to be more clear if we look at an example. So if we calculate the simple interest, here's a question to calculate the interest on a financial instrument that is sold for 10,000 Rand and has a lifespan of 2 years if the interest rate is 5% and the simple interest method is used to calculate the interest. So this 5% is 5% interest per year or per annum. So the simple interest is then that formula. So it's 10,000 Rand times 5%. So 5 divided times 100. And because it is for 2 years times 2. And if you do that calculation, you're going to see that the answer is 1,000. So the simple interest is 1,000. Now, the future value that will have to be paid back is then the present value plus the interest of 1,000 Rand, which is 11,000 Rand. So that is the amount that the borrower is going to have to pay back, that the lender is going to receive. So the lender lent out 10,000 Rand, but will receive 11,000 Rand. Therefore, the reward that he or she is earning is 1,000 Rand. So if we look at compound interest, it means that there is also interest earned on the interest. I just want to go back to the previous slide. So if we look at this, we can see that at the end of the first year, there will already be interest that has been earned, but no interest is earned on this if we use the simple interest method. When we look at compound interest, then interest will also be earned on the interest that is received during the first year. So if we calculate the interest on a financial instrument that is sold for 10,000 Rand, has a lifespan of 2 years, the interest is 5%. So everything is exactly the same as for the previous example, but now the compound interest method is used to calculate the interest. So the formula to calculate the future value is then 10,000 Rand times, in brackets, 1 plus the 5%, 5 divided by 100, close the brackets, to the power of 2. So it's 10,000 Rand times 1 plus 0.05 to the power of 2. And if you do that calculation, you're going to see that your answer is 11,025 Rand. So you will remember that in the previous example, it was 11,000 Rand. So that extra 25 Rand is actually the interest that is earned on the interest that was earned during the first year that this financial instrument was existing. So the compound interest, as we've indicated, is then the difference between the future value and the present value. So it is the 11,025 minus the 10,000 Rand. So your compound interest is 1,025 Rand. So if we compare the two, we can see that this, for the simple interest, you remember it was 11,000 Rand. For the compound interest, it's 11,025. So the difference is due to the fact that interest is also earned on the interest amount earned for the first year. So you have to understand how to calculate simple interest and how to calculate compound interest and the reason for the difference in the values. So if we look at the financial markets, we distinguish between two main categories. We distinguish between the money market and the bond market or the capital market. So the money market is the short-term market. So that is for borrowing and lending short-term, whereas the bond or capital market is the long-term market. So they are different instruments that are traded in the money market and the bond market, and the way in which calculations are done on those different instruments also differ. But as I've indicated, we're not going to look at that in detail. That is covered elsewhere in the module ECS 2605 on the South African financial markets. You just have to understand what is the money market and what is the bond or capital market for this, for the purposes of this module. So just to give you a brief overview of the financial markets. So here we have on this side the lenders or the people who have surplus funds, and they can come from any sector of the economy. They can be households that have extra funds, for example, households that are investing money for their retirement one day. It can be a business that has excess funds available currently. It can be the government if they have excess funds available, or maybe just the government department that has excess funds available, or it can be the foreign sector that want to invest inside our country. And then on the other side, we have the borrowers. So they will be the sectors that are experiencing deficits. They need to borrow funds. So you can see it's exactly the same sectors that are included here: businesses, government, households, and foreigners. So all the sectors can be surplus or can contain surplus units, and all the sectors can contain deficit units. So the surplus unit will take their funds and invest it in the financial markets, and then those funds will then go to the borrowers. So the borrowers will sell certain types of financial assets. To them, it's liabilities. To the lenders, to them, it's assets on the financial markets. And at the end of their lifespan, or sometimes also during their lifespan, the capital plus the interest will be paid back to the lenders. So the lenders will earn interest on the funds that they've invested, while the borrowers will pay interest on the funds that they have borrowed and then also pay back the capital. So when financing takes place like this, we call it direct financing. So it means that the lenders are buying instruments directly from the borrowers. It can take place, for example, through the JSE, the Joburg Stock Exchange, but it does not necessarily have to be through an exchange. It can also be sold directly. Right. But some people prefer not to lend directly to borrowers, but to rather invest their funds with financial intermediaries, for example, banks or different types of funds. So the surplus sectors take their excess funds and they give them to financial intermediaries. The financial intermediaries, for example, the banks, then provide credit to these deficit units. And the deficit units then have to pay back capital and interest, which goes via the financial intermediaries back to those who invested with the financial intermediaries. So this is what we call indirect financing. Right, so those are the two ways of financing that takes place in the money and capital markets. Both of these can involve money market instruments, and both of these can involve capital market instruments. So both can involve long-term as well as short-term instruments. If it is short-term, we usually call it money market instruments, I've indicated previously. And when it is long-term, we call it capital market instruments. These are a few examples of money market instruments that you can go and have a look at and see if you can determine what those rates currently is. Many of these are also published in the Reserve Bank Bulletin. So the repo rate is the rate at which the Reserve Bank lends money to banks when they are in deficit. And therefore, this repo rate, that is the important rate that we always hear about, that the Monetary Policy Committee decides on. This repo rate affects all of these other interest rates in the money market. When the repo rate goes up, all of these interest rates will usually react immediately. Sometimes even before the repo rate changes, if people in the markets are sure that the repo rate is going to change. You can never be 100% sure, but you can be reasonably sure what is going to happen to the repo rate, because the Monetary Policy Committee does not try to keep it as a surprise. They also try to send signals to the market so that they know what is going to happen, that it should not be a surprise. Then there are also repurchase agreements that take place between banks and other businesses. So they are similar to the repurchase agreements that that is used to conduct the repo rate transactions, but we do not call them repo rate because it's just to distinguish the repo rate from the others. Right. You have to understand the Reserve Bank's accommodation policy. There's a brief discussion provided on that, and I think you've also done this in your first year. You have to understand what the prime overdraft rate is. So the prime overdraft rate is the rate at which banks will lend money to their best clients. So that will usually be the lowest rate at which the private sector can find financing in the economy. Then there are treasury bills, which is also a money market instrument. So treasury bills is when the government has short-term funding needs. Treasury bills can be issued, for example, for 3 months. They sell it in the market at a certain rate, and then they buy it back after 3 months and pay the interest rates on that. Then there's the Johannesburg Interbank Agreed Rate. So that is when banks lend money to each other. So when there's a bank with a deficit and a bank with a surplus, the surplus bank can provide money to the bank with a deficit for a short term, and that is then taken, that takes place at a certain interest rate, and all those different interest rates are taken into account and affects the JBAR, the Johannesburg Interbank Agreed Rate. Because of course, if one bank knows that they can borrow at a cheaper rate than another from another bank that has a surplus, they're going to rather borrow from them. So therefore, these rates at which the banks lend to each other and borrow from each other will be more or less similar. And then call money rates is when businesses or even individuals invest money with banks, but it is available. They say it's call money, which means it's available at very short notice. Interest is paid on it because it will usually involve rather large amounts. So the interest rate on it will not be very high, but it is available rather quickly if the businesses need them. Remember, many of the other types of instruments, financial instruments, if you purchase them, they will not be very liquid. You will have to wait until they mature sometimes to be able to receive your funds back. So there's a little bit of a risk attached to that if you are going to need the funds in the meantime. But with call money rates, it will usually be a little bit lower than the other rates because it is available rather quickly if you need the funds for some reason in the meantime. Then in the bond or capital market, it is important that you understand what a bond is. A bond is an interest-bearing security issued by a unit experiencing a financial deficit for periods ranging from 1 to 24 years. So if you buy a bond, you are going to provide that money now to the deficit unit, and it can be for a long time, and usually you will receive interest on an annual basis. So if it lasts for 25 years, you're going to receive a certain rate of interest, a certain amount of interest every year for that 25 years, or whichever length the bond runs for. So the nominal value of a bond is the value on which interest is paid. The coupon interest rate of a bond is the regular interest rate that is paid at a fixed or variable rate on the nominal value until maturity. So usually a bond will have a nominal value and there will be a coupon interest rate, let's say 10%, and that 10% is calculated as a percentage of the nominal value. And there can be different issuers. It can be issued by the government. It can be issued by public corporations, such as the SABC, for example, or it can be issued by some municipalities also issue bonds, and then definitely private companies can also issue bonds. what are factors that will affect the interest rates? And this is now especially interest rates on bonds. The most important, or one of the most important factors that will affect the interest rate is the loan term. In other words, for how long you are going to borrow this money. So if you are going to borrow it for a longer term, there is more risk attached to it, and then usually the interest rate will be higher. If it's just for a short term, there's less risk, and then usually the interest rate will be lower. The inflation rate is an important determinant of interest rates in any country. So if the interest rate is lower than the inflation rate, it actually means that the lenders are not compensated at all because they will lose purchasing power. So the interest rate has to be at least equal to the inflation rate in order to maintain purchasing power. And of course, you have to reward the lender for providing the liquidity. Therefore, the interest rate will be higher than the inflation rate. So the higher the inflation rate, the higher interest rates in a country will be. And if you expect the inflation rate to increase, of course, then the interest rates will also increase. The borrower's ability to repay. I've discussed risk in the first, when we discussed the loan term. So, of course, some borrowers are more risky than others. You're less sure that they will be able to repay, and therefore they will have to pay higher interest rates. A borrower that is less risky will usually be able to pay lower interest rates. Then the Monetary Policy Committee, as I've indicated to you previously, the repo rate is one of the most important factors that affect all interest rates in the money market, but it also affects interest rates in the capital market. So the Monetary Policy Committee and their decisions on the repo rate has an important effect on the level of interest rates in the country. And therefore, all the factors that the Monetary Policy Committee takes into account when they decide on the level of the repo rate are important if you want to predict how interest rates are going to change in the future. So you can go and read the Monetary Policy Committee's monetary policy statements, and then you will see all the different factors that they take into account when they take decisions on the interest rate level, on whether the repo rate should increase or not. So the expected inflation rate is one of the most important factors that will affect the decision of the Monetary Policy Committee, because as we know, the Reserve Bank's objective is to maintain the value of the currency. In other words, to keep the inflation rate between 3% and 6% and to make sure it doesn't go beyond that. So when they think that the inflation rate is going to increase, then they will most likely increase the repo rate. And when they think that the inflation rate is not going to increase, or that maybe there are other factors that can cause a decrease even in the inflation rate, that the rate of increase in prices is going to become less, then the repo rate may be decreased. We also discussed this in the previous class when we spoke about inflation. So go and read these monetary policy statements. It's always very interesting to see all the factors that affected the decision of the Monetary Policy Committee. They definitely, you will see that sometimes you will read in the news that people journalists talk about the fact that the Monetary Policy Committee do not take growth into account. But if you go and read what they say, and the reasoning behind their decisions, you will see that they definitely also consider economic growth. We have to remember that if we think back to that last slide of the section on wages, when our economy becomes less competitive, the economy cannot grow because we cannot export our goods. Goods in the country also becomes more expensive. So it's possible that people lose their jobs due to people inside the country not being able to buy it, but also due to the fact that our goods cannot be exported, that there's not a demand for it overseas. So all of those things have to be considered by the Monetary Policy Committee. They have to keep inflation intact. They have to make sure that the inflation rate does not go too high, and they definitely do that in order to encourage economic growth. Then the last section in this learning unit is then about interest rates and discount rates. So I'm just going to go through that quickly. So the interest rate, as we've indicated, is the rate of return to the investor, or then also the rate that the borrower will pay. So the coupon rate on a bond is the annual interest calculated as a percentage of the nominal value of a bond. So the nominal value is a value that will usually be, I want to say, be printed on the document, on the bond. Sorry, let me just go back one slide. But it's not really true nowadays because bonds are not printed anymore. But in olden days, you would have a document, and on that document, the nominal value would be printed. So now it will be a contract that you will receive, and the contract will indicate the nominal value. As I say, it's not really printed, but there will probably be a PDF document, if we can call that printed. So that is the nominal value. It's the value that you can actually see of the bond. And then the interest rate that is paid on the bond will be determined by both the coupon rate and the buying price. So what does this mean? It means that a bond or a financial instrument is not always sold at the nominal value. It can be sold at a price higher than the nominal value, but usually it is a price lower than the nominal value. And the discount rate will determine how large that discount is to the nominal value. So there's a discount rate that has to be considered. That will determine the buying price, and then the actual interest rate that you pay on the bond or receive on the bond is determined by the coupon rate and the buying price, not really by the coupon rate and the nominal value, because the interest rate will be determined by what you actually paid for it, and that is determined by the discount rate. Right, so make sure you understand this. This is also a concept that you will understand better if you do ECS 2605, because there you then do all these different calculations. We do not expect you to understand all these relationships and do all these. Well, we expect you to understand the relationships in broad, but not do all the different calculations. Right. Then the basis point and percentage point, this is something I think also that was covered in Learning Unit 2, but it is just revised here again. You have to remember that 100 basis points is 1 percentage point. So if an interest rate changes from 10% to 11%, it changes by 1 percentage point, but it changes by 100 basis points. And we also say that there is a 10% change in the rate if it changes from 10 to 11%, because it changes by 1%. It was 10% previously, times 100 gives us 10%. So the change in the rate, the percentage change in the rate is 10%, but it changes by 1 percentage point, and it changes by 100 basis points. So please make sure that you're also able to distinguish between these different concepts, between basis point, percentage point, and percentage change in the interest rate. Okay, then we also have to distinguish between real and nominal interest rate. So the nominal interest rate is the actual interest rate that is ruling at a particular time, while the real interest rate, like usually, is when the change in prices or the rate of inflation is also taken into account. So why is this important? It is important because we have to make sure that a lender is compensated for inflation as well as receive a return for parting with his liquidity for a while. So therefore, the nominal interest rate will usually be higher than the real interest rate by the rate of inflation. And a way in which we can calculate it or approximate it is by subtracting the inflation rate from the nominal interest rate. So if the nominal interest rate is 9% and the inflation rate is 4%, we say that the real interest rate is 5%. So the difference between those two give us the real interest rate. And the expected inflation rate is, we usually assume that it is equal to the current inflation rate, unless there are very good reasons to expect that the inflation rate will go up or down. Then sometimes you may take a higher or a lower rate than the current inflation rate into account. Right, ladies and gentlemen, so that is my presentation on Learning Unit 10. Are there any questions on this now? Letabo?
Morning, ma'am.
Hi, good morning.
I have a question.
Yes?
Where the slide of M1, M2, M3.
Okay. You want me to go back there? I'll quickly open it and go back there. Here it is. Sure why it does not want to show. Just going to stop sharing and start again.
Then?
I am here. I'm just trying to get it. It's up and running now. Can you see it yet? There we go. I think you should be able to see it now.
So my question is, what is the difference between current and transmission accounts and with demand deposits?
So current and transmission accounts, there will usually be no interest that is paid on them. Whereas demand deposits, there can be interest paid on demand deposits depending on how long you're planning to hold them for. So that would be the most important difference. Current accounts and transmission accounts, I do not think nowadays there are lots of differences between those two. I think the difference is made in terms of the number of transactions that you are allowed to do when you have those accounts. Usually on a transmission account, there will be less transfers that you are allowed to make. And if you want to make more transfers, you are going to have to pay higher bank fees. Whereas with a current account, you will usually be able to make more transfers, more payments using electronic. So in the old days, this used to refer to a check account. But as you know, nowadays, we do not use check accounts any longer at all. So being able to distinguish between these is becoming more and more technical. And yeah, as I've indicated to you, the way I understand it is that the transmission account is usually the cheapest account. There will be limited transmissions allowed, whereas a current account is what a company will usually have, and they can make any number of transfers that they wish, and they will pay bank fees according to that. And then demand deposits are deposits on which interest can then also be earned. Even though it will be very low because it's a demand deposit, some kind of interest can be earned on it. And then the longer you hold it, usually the interest rate will be higher.
I have a final question.
Yes.
So when looking at levels and percentage rate of change, which one do you more or less look at when you are judging the growth of a figure?
It depends on what you want to do with it. Of course, to calculate the percentage change, you first have to calculate the level of change. So if you want to calculate by how much M3 has changed, you first have to look at what was M3 at the end of 2023. Then you have to look at what it was at the end of 2024. The difference between those two will give you the level of change in M3, and then to calculate the percentage change in M3, you will then have to calculate the change as a percentage of what it was in 2023. Usually when we are looking at comparing different changes, for example, if we want to see what was the change in M3, what was the change in the level of economic activity, the real GDP, or the change in the inflation rate, we will look at percentage changes, because it's easier to compare things if they are all in terms of percentages. We cannot really compare the level of change in the inflation index and the level of change in M3. It doesn't make sense to do that because it's different aggregates.
Can you use salaries as an example? Wages.
Salaries.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we're looking at salaries, and you look at an actual increase in a salary, you know, it increases from, let's say, 300,000 Rand a year to 320,000 Rand a year. Okay, then the level of change is 20,000. You agree with that?
I agree with that.
Okay, then the percentage change, if we calculate that quickly, let me put the calculator there. If you want to calculate the percentage change, it's then going to be the 20,000 divided by what it was previously, 300,000. So we can see times 100, So you can see that the salary increased by 6.7%. Now, if you want to look at productivity, for example, compared to a person's productivity compared to the increase in the person's salary, then you will look at percentages, because you want to compare by how much the productivity changed compared to the amount by which the wage changed, the percentage by which the wage changed. It doesn't make sense to just look at the levels, you look at the percentages. It just makes it easier to understand.
Oh, I see now.
Do you understand the difference, Letobo?
More or less, the thing is, I need more time to understand, because looking at how much, comparing, like, for example, one person is earning 500,000 and increased by maybe more. Is it possible to explain it that way, if you have enough time?
Sorry, just repeat.
When you're comparing, like, for example, if a person earns 300,000 and increased to 320,000, and then comparing with someone, is it how do you compare one person's salary with another person's salary?
I'm not sure what you want me to explain.
Comparing two individuals. Let's just say a person called A has 300,000 salary starting from last year, and it increased by 320,000. And then person B salary increased. It was from 500,000 and increased by maybe 100,000. Then comparing the percentage change, which one is greater?
Okay, so we've looked at the example where it increased from, let me just open a Word document so that we can put everything there. Okay, so the salary, we looked at the salary that was increased from
300,000
to 320,000, and we said that was 6.7%.
Yes.
Okay. Now we have a salary that increased from, you say 500,000?
500,000 and 100,000.
To
600,000, I mean.
To 600,000.
600,000, I meant to say 600,000.
So now we can calculate that change. Let me take it to this side. So it increases by 100,000, so it's 100,000 divided by, it was 500,000 times 100. So we can see that increased by 20%. Okay, I think you will also want to know maybe if the salary of 300,000 increased by 20%, how much would that then be?
It will be helpful if I understand is the difference between the percentage change that makes person B have a better situation. That's what you're trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that if it increased by the difference between the percentage change is far greater than the levels.
Let's say if the salary increased from 300,000 to 400,000.
Yeah.
Okay. So
Makes
the increase is exactly the same as for this person. The level of change is the same, but let's now calculate the percentage change, and you will see it's bigger because the amount from which it changed was smaller. Times 100. So now we can see that is a 33% increase. Is that what you wanted me to explain?
Yeah. That's what I wanted to say. So looking
Okay.
at these figures, which person is better off?
Which person is
Between
better off?
Yeah, better off between 20% and 33%.
So it depends on what we can say, that the person who earns 300,000 and is now earning 400,000 receives the largest increase, the largest percentage increase. Although the level of increase is the same as for the person that earned 500,000 and is now earning 600,000.
Oh.
For that person, remember, in both cases, the increase was 100,000.
That's the level.
That is the level of change.
Now it makes sense, man.
Okay.
Yes.
But which one is better off? Of course, the one who is earning the most is still better off.
Yes, of course.
But this one's increase was bigger because the level from which it changed was smaller.
So what will happen if the ones that is earning 300,000 increase to 600,000? Is he more than well better off because they are at the same levels?
Of course.
So that's
because
when you can say they're much better.
Increase by a higher percentage, but then at the same level. He's going to reach the same level, but his increase is going to be much higher.
It's much higher. Man, you just made it clearer for trying to put it under a PDF.
Okay.
Makes sense. I don't have any problem in the near future. I couldn't understand between the levels and then the risk of change. So, but you made it much clearer.
Okay. All right, Letobo.
Thank you, ma'am.
Any other questions? Kay Mortolo. Kay Mortolo, do you have a question that you want to ask? Not. No other questions? Okay. If the Ketsu. Yes.
Yes. Okay. Okay, I'll go first. Yeah.
Okay.
Ma'am, just a quick question. When calculating the percentage, just with those examples that you've put on the screen there, obviously with the last one, I'll focus on the last one just to get it. So obviously it increased from 300 to 400. There was an increase of 100. That's very clear. And then when calculating the percentage of the percentage increase, why did you use, so it will be 100,000 divided by 300 and then multiply by 100, obviously, to get the percentage. Would I be incorrect if I used 100,000 divided by 400 over? Why are we using 300 as opposed to 2?
Because remember, you're always dividing by what it was initially.
Okay.
So it increased from 300,000 to 400,000. So you have to divide by what it was initially.
Okay.
Okay, so for example, if you're calculating the growth rate in the GDP, it is also the change in the GDP by what it was in the previous year.
Oh, it's always what it was in the previous. Okay.
It's always what it was previously.
Okay.
Another way to calculate it, of course, would be 400,000 divided by 300,000 minus 1 times 100. Okay. So you can also do it that way.
Okay, do you mind just writing it there for us? Just that.
So if we say 400,000 divide, sorry, no, I didn't put in all the zeros. I'm doing it shorthand. 400,000 divided by 300,000. okay, minus 1 times 100.
Oh, okay. Nah,
So
that's
I
even
take the
better.
second one divided by the first one times 100, minus 1 times 100 over 1. And you can
Okay.
see the percentage is the same. We get the same answer.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. No, clear.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay, okay, if there are no more questions, I'm just going to talk about the exam quickly. Kay Moratolo, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. I wanted to know, during the exam, are we going to have to go to the SARB bulletin and download it, or will it be given to us?
Okay, so similar to the assignment, that's what I wanted to talk about. You were reading my mind ahead. So similar to the assignment, we are going to give you certain publications that you have to use in the examination. Those will also be shared with you before the exam. So you will be able to see which publications you are going to use in the exam. And we expect you to go through those publications before you participate in the exam so that you know where what is in that specific publication, that it doesn't take you a long time to find it. The questions that you will be asked, most of them will be similar to the questions, not the same questions, but similar to the questions that you did in the assignments and that are included in the example questions that are included in your learning units. So all those learning activity questions. So it's similar to them, not the same as I say, but similar. There is one or two questions that you've not come across previously, because of course we want to see whether you understand really what you are doing. But those are the questions that will make the difference between obtaining 90% and 100%. It will not count too much of the total. The exam is going to be like the assignments. It's going to be a multiple choice exam. There's going to be 35 questions, and you have to answer all of those questions in the allocated time. All the questions do not count exactly the same. Some of them involves more calculation, and they will count more. And there will also be calculation questions. They count more, but there's also true-false questions, and a true-false question cannot really count more than one in the exam. Then there are a few multiple choice questions that can count 1 or 2 marks. So the number of marks allocated depend on how long it should take you to do the question. The questions are also spread through the learning material more or less equally. So there's about 7 marks that come from each learning unit. So you cannot ignore some learning units. There will be questions on it in the exam. But it also means that if there's a learning unit that is a big problem for you and you just cannot understand those questions, not the whole exam will come from that question. So the exam will be very balanced in terms of the learning units. You have to know all of them. I just want to go to the chat to share Dr. Litter's document that she shared with us. But first tell me, are there any questions for now in the exam? I'm also going to send out a document or an announcement on it so that you will have it in print. Or not in print, similar to a bond. You will have the document, but it's not in print. So let me just take it to my other screen so that you can see it. Okay, so institutions matter, think like an economist. Dr. Letter, do you want to explain to us what is happening here?
Thank you, Sia. It was just in relation to that student who asked about cheap imports. The whole thing is you need to approach it holistically. And when they deal with questions like that, it's a very easy way to go through those steps. As currently, the whole world is on knife edge with tariffs and trade wars. So with any of the topics they are dealing with and they have questions, it's a very nice way to approach it, because now there's not always one clear-cut answer that addresses everything. It's just a philosophical way to approach it, and maybe some of the issues they encounter in the module. Thank you.
Thanks, Brunette. Yeah, so as she indicates, you have to consider the opportunity cost. You have to consider unanticipated influence, things that you did not think even before the time. So you have to think, what things can happen due to this decision that I am making? Because your unintended consequences can sometimes be very important. You did not think before the time it's going to happen, but then it has a huge effect. And yeah, I think what that Dr. Letter is trying to say is that maybe Trump did not consider all the unintended consequences as well. We do not know. But then also we have to consider the opportunity cost, which is also something that we often forget. So, for example, if you think of free education, so free education, I think everyone will agree that it's a very good thing. But if you consider that if you have free education, the money has to come from somewhere. And what do you have to give up in order to have free education? Are you going to decrease spending on health? Are you going to decrease maybe spending on nursery schools? Are you going to decrease pensions? So someone is going to be affected by the fact that there is free education or free higher education for all students. So yeah, that is the important things when you are an economist. You cannot think just in terms of the decision that you are taking now. You have to think of all the different factors that may be changed due to that. Right, are there any questions on this? No questions? I see there's some questions on that someone is typing in the chat. So I'll just wait for that to come. Okay, thanks for the list. 1, 2. Yes, there is going to be another lesson. There's going to be one lesson where on learning unit 12, so that learning unit 11. There is no learning unit 12. Sorry. So there's going to be one more lesson on learning unit 11. So that will be a quick quick one because it should, but if you have questions on that particular day on other sections of the work, you can also bring those. Ladies and gentlemen, if there are no other questions, then I thank you for being here. I'm going to try to save this recording and save it and share it with you so that everyone will have access to it afterwards. But do remember that the slides for the classes, which actually contains most of the content, is available in the additional resources folder. Yes, there will be one last one before the exam. Ubuntu. Okay. Thank you for being here, ladies and gentlemen. I wish you all well, and yeah, please start preparing for the exam. It is definitely not far off. Bye-bye. Have a good day.
Bye.